You're listening to The Adventuring Party, discussing tabletop and related gaming, and the Irish gaming scene, so you don't have to.
Welcome to the party. Today, it's Owen.
I'm Savage.
It is Shane.
And we are here with our special guest Warhammer players, Baz and Colin, here to discuss what happens when you don't have too many models, and you don't have too few models, but in fact, you have just the right amount of models.
No, we've definitely got too many models.
Yeah. If you don't have too many models, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah,
it's
but also too few for what we actually want to do.
So we're not talking about filling a table here. We're going to talk about a handful of models, a handful of dice, a lick of wit, and a game is born. And we're talking about skirmish games today, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Why should I play it? First of all, what distinguishes a skirmish game from, a pub fight or a grand battle? There should be a pub fight skirmish game, shouldn't there?
In general, when you're comparing sort of your levels of wargame, the big distinguisher, the number of figures on the table is a big one. Skirmish games traditionally will have maybe a dozen or so models on either side of the forces. But to me, the core difference is, do models operate individually and independently, or do they operate as part of a unit? So if you're playing Warhammer 40,000 and you have some Space Marines, they're part of a squad of Space Marines, and those guys have to stick together, they act together. Whereas if you're playing...
The stat lines all look the same, right?
Yeah. There may be some variation in there, but they are a unit. Whereas if you're playing a skirmish game like Kill Team, each model doesn't have to stay without anybody else. It can be wildly different to the guy next beside it, and they operate independently.
Okay. Yeah, it can be interesting because the Perry brothers release a travel edition of Waterloo that is relatively low model count.
Let's go back on that one. So Perry brothers are great sculptors.
Yeah.
They worked for GW for years. One of them lost a hand.
Three arms between them, yeah.
3 arms between them. One lost a hand to a
cannonball accident. Yeah.
Which is, in the modelling community, that's one of...
And was sculpting models about a month later to his...
Because you get that great
his
claw.
brilliant standard.
You can really lock the model into the claw and then work away.
But I mean, can you ever say that Waterloo is a skirmish?
Well, I was just going to say, there's a lot to unpack there. How do they manage that?
Well, it's just a small board, and there's a small number of models that are representing entire regiments rather than...
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, so
physically it's relatively small.
Yeah.
You're not covering a big 6x4 table along those lines. So I mean, you might consider that to be a skirmish game because of the low model count, but I think Colin's interpretation is probably better.
Individually
compact or miniaturized version of a full-scale war game.
Yeah, that's probably a much better way of looking at it.
If we're talking about a few hardy souls, what kind of companies are pushing out good skirmish games now?
There's quite a few of them doing the rounds. Games Workshop, as the £800 gorilla in the wargaming room, has its own range at the moment, which includes Warcry, which is their fantasy game. It includes Kill Team, which is their Warhammer 40,000 setting one. What else are they doing?
So arguably, they also have an Age of Sigmar skirmish game, as distinct from Warcry, which is just a lower points version of Age of Sigmar. They have Necromunda.
Warhammer Underworlds, if you want to count it.
Yeah, I mean, there'd be some discussion of whether that's a board game with miniatures.
So Games Workshop are clearly busy in that area, but plenty of other companies are doing them too. There's any number of sort of smaller independent publishers that are putting out games, say miniatures agnostic games, where it's we're not also selling you models, we're just, here's some rules. You get guys like Osprey Publishing are doing Black Ops, which is a wonderful little skirmish game with great sort of unique mechanics built into it that you don't find anywhere else.
I think I've heard it described as Metal Gear Solid.
It is.
The game.
It's got this great stealth mechanic where everything seems to be going really well until somebody rings the bell and suddenly it's all goes to hell. Ambush Alley Games they still have their Ambush Alley and Force on Force games, which are great skirmish games. This Ambush Alley in particular is asymmetric, so one side might be just 4 army rangers and the other side is a literally unending horde of the local militia, and the two sides will have vastly different goals on how they are going to win the game. So causing casualties on one side might have no effect, but causing casualties on the super elite guys is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, might even count as a victory, even if the local militia gets swept.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to call you on Ambush Alley because it sometimes features vehicles. But then I recall that GW had a pretty vehicle-heavy skirmish game called Gorka Morka back in the day.
Yep.
So
Did
I
get
think
a
that would
re-release.
count as a...
Speed Freaks, which is
Yeah.
Is that there's a new one, yeah. So it's not that we haven't had skirmish games before, but there really does seem to be an uptick in the numbers of skirmish games we're getting at the moment. Would you say there's any reasons why that's happening and why GW seems to have gone, well, we've run out of fingers on one hand to count the number of skirmish games that seem to be pumping out at the moment? Why is that?
And just to add, you've still got a ton of games that you've missed out.
Oh, yeah? Well,
Corvus Belli are doing Infinity, which is a fantastic skirmish game. Bolt Action, like World War II, you consider that a skirmish game. Like, there are Napoleonic skirmish games. So there are literally skirmish games everywhere.
I thought Infinity was like a proper war game. I didn't realise it was a skirmish game.
It would be skirmish, like you do massive boards, but you end up with maybe 10, 12 miniatures on either side.
Cowboys
and
and
all
Indians.
individuals.
all about the terrain.
It's a Wild West skirmish game.
There's the funky high-tech Wild West one from the English guys. Oh, Wild West.
But there is a straight. I can't remember what the name of it is, but I know
GW
there's
Classics line. Or
there is they do also do that. Yeah, 'cause I've seen people talking about the scenery for it. But there is Western skirmish games where you can just fight it out.
So the
X-Wing, from FFG,
Yeah, that would count.
and God Tier just out from Steamforge Games.
Don't know that one.
I think skirmish games have actually been very popular in their own kind of spheres for quite a while. We have definitely seen Games Workshop kind of jump into it over the past few years. Like even the games I've mentioned, Ambush Alley's been around for quite a while now. Black Ops is a few years old. And I think what we're seeing is Games Workshop has noticed this, finally kind of they've pinned down and said, you know what, this is a good area that we can get into. Yeah. There is a niche here.
Were they pushed that way by Privateer Press, who had Hoards and Warmachine, that kind of focused on reducing the number of models on the table? Or do they count as skirmish games?
I think they were once. They're certainly not anymore. I think maybe they saw the success of Warmachine and Hoards back in the day, as it were. But I think the recent resurgence maybe is unconnected to that. I don't feel like Privateer Press are really pressuring the market.
Privateer hurt them in America very badly a couple of years ago. Not right now, not anymore. Yeah. But I think one of the impetuses towards their big sea change in management style was the fact that Privateer was hurting them severely in the States. Okay. They're being hurt very badly there by Privateer. Not so much over here, but in the States, it got a bit squirrely for them for a while.
Yeah, you had another point you wanted to jump in with.
Yeah, but I think looking at why Games Workshop are doing skirmish games, I think that's something we need to push off for a little bit. I think first off, you need to look at why the other companies are doing skirmish games. And the big thing with that is if you're a brand new company setting up miniatures, if you make 20 miniatures, that's 10 aside for 2 factions, and you're good to go with a skirmish game. Alternatively,
much easier to get a new customer on that proposition.
Alternatively, you can wait until you've got 100 miniatures on each side and you're 2-3 years down your production line, and then you can start selling your game to people. Yeah, that's a little bit trickier.
So do you see a possibility for, say, Infinity to, over the next few years, to develop into what we might call a company level game in the same way as, on the same scale as
they certainly
40K?
Could, but they seem to be moving in a different direction. They've actually been doubling down to an extent. Aratasia is one of the big ones that they came out with in the last few years, which is a arena style game where you have 3 or 4 models and you play on a board. Similarly, they've just finished up a Kickstarter for Defiance, I think it was.
Their board game, yeah.
Yeah, which was it's a dungeon crawl style game. So they're really doubling down on the idea of having a small model count, but they've produced massive amount of miniatures at this stage. And they were coming, like, it's Corvus Belli are the producers. Originally they started as a fantasy, I think it was a 15 mil company. And that kind of got so far for them, and then they started doing their own sci-fi miniatures, and that took off. So they dropped the fantasy side.
Scale is definitely one of the sort of deciding factors, isn't it? It's one of those defining factors for skirmish games. You don't see too many of them that go below, say, 20 mil, or with the exception of, what was it, Inquisitor back in the day, above, what was it, 54 mil? Or
yeah, they did 54 mil with Inquisitor. Those
lovely models. I think they were hunting around for a game to apply them to.
Yeah.
Shane, you're not much of a skirmisher, are you?
No, but then again, if I was to get into wargaming as a hobby at some point, I would very much be more tempted by something like Kill Team or Necromunda, something where I could have a little bit of individuality and a small buying base at the start, and then maybe build up something larger thing. For me, especially, the major impediment to wargaming is the investment of models and getting to know them. Whereas I'm very much I want to play with the rules. I want to get into onto the build and rolling the dice. And
you love painting, though, don't you? And then making terrain and. No, maybe I'm thinking of someone else.
I'm thinking of literally anyone else in the entire Eastern Seaboard.
But it does sort of reduce the number of models you'd have to paint to any sort of standard, and as you say, it's quicker to table.
Listeners, if there's a reason I threw away my the things I painted from the old 40k second ed starter box. Those were painful to look at.
Sort of Bosch rather than Sistine Chapel.
More like some of them looked like they'd be just dipped in the paint pots. It was quite horrible.
So we'll be bringing Shane's 4-part painting tutorial to you soon enough. But dipping with Shane.
So interestingly, like, Shane is exactly what Games Workshop are looking for at the moment, I think. So what we've been talking about earlier is kind of getting started with a new company and getting into the game. But with Games Workshop, they want you to buy a lot of models, and really they'd like you to be playing 40k Apocalypse. Not just 40k Apocalypse. That's
units of tanks.
Probably with, several different armies. But you need to start somewhere.
Is that all these things are for these companies then, sort of gateways?
It's hard to tell, but that there's a very strong suspicion that Kill Team in particular was probably pitched and signed off on and put into production as, here is a gateway to get players, and they were almost certainly targeting very, not even necessarily brand new players, but lapsed players.
The number of people that I know, we both know, that were sort of big 6x4 table, 40k or Warhammer players back in the day who've jumped into Kill Team especially.
Yeah, and I think the game has tremendous appeal to those players, and I'm one of them. I did most of my playing in second ed, maybe a little touch of Rogue Trader, then second ed, and I would have started to fade out of the game around third ed. So I've been out of 40k for a long time, but Kill Team came along and it's like, well, here's this nice, neat little package, and all those models that I still admire because Games Workshop produce wonderful figures. I can buy small quantities of them, paint up just the ones I really like the look of, and then play a game with them.
And you say you faded out around third ed. Just for those who are keeping score at home, what edition are they on?
They're currently on 8th edition of Warhammer 40,000. And 9th edition is on the horizon, I believe.
But you still have many of those models from back in the day.
That's the thing. I don't
any use for them in one of these new skirmish games.
Absolutely. That was, again, one of the appeals is I didn't have to go buy new stuff. I have boxes and drawers of models, and I could just open them up, whip out the bits, and I've got the pieces that I can put together a Kill Team with.
But you did buy new stuff eventually, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
6 new models. It's the other thing that I've noticed in the current crop is that there's an awful lot more emphasis on terrain as something that you're not just going to knock together from some shoeboxes, but rather the companies are now putting out very nice terrain that is specific to the games they're making and carries a lot of the themes and tone.
Arguably that's a kind of a key element of the skirmish games, because when you've got a table and you kind of set out your big regiment style war game, it looks really impressive, even if you just got a green mat, you don't have any other scenery on it. It looks awesome. But once you start bringing that down to a really low model count, that doesn't look quite as good, so you need to start dropping in a little bit of scenery. And depending on how the rule set is done, sometimes that scenery can be absolutely key. Hugging the cover, trying to sneak up and outflank people on the sides, like major big elements of the game. So yeah, it can be very important.
You're playing with sort of what's there is what you get. There's no abstraction of cover or anything like that. If I can see his elbow, I can probably get him, but
shoot him in the elbow. Yeah,
right in the elbow.
My biggest issue with Kill Team is that they're still measuring it. They haven't gone to a greater. You still measure stuff. You want to roll. You run 4 inches. And I'm like, oh god, no! Come on, guys. We could do grids. We could do hexes. Can we stop with this, please?
Really?
Yeah. It always breaks it for me. I'm always like, it's me going, oh, did I actually measure that accurately or not? Like, because I'm like going, did I?
Well,
and
I can see that being an issue if you're playing in the kind of context where people are very finicky about your quarter-inch gap.
But also you're moving around terrain and stuff, and I'm like, where this is like. Whereas if it was squares or grid, I was just like, okay, well, I moved here. How far did you move? How many hexes was that? 3?
Yeah, I can understand that. So there was
3 and a bit. No, 3.
There were a couple of knife incidents between me and Colin when we were playing, and eventually Colin decided maybe we should declare our intent. And we've been playing by intent for quite a while, and it's really worked out well.
Yeah, and what that means is, when I say, instead of just moving my guy up to this corner, I move the guy up to the corner and say, look, the intent here is that he's visible to that target, not visible to that target, and still 8 inches away from that other guy. And that means that if it then comes down to the next turn, it's like, well, is he within
2
or
millimeters away?
Yeah. We know what the intent was, and we allow for
you're no longer sniping.
But that's the bit. I would love it if I was moving on the grid. I was like, now I don't have to worry about counting, and it makes the line of sight rules often easier to do. It's
that's all perfectly valid. The flip side of it is that when you don't have a grid, when you've got freedom of movement and you're moving by measurement, you have more freedom, you have more flexibility.
Absolutely.
You can how you set up your table as well.
Yeah.
Luckily.
And it also makes it feel, or to me, it's you're into the area there where you're defining the differences between a war game and, say, a board game.
Yeah, and that's a tricky one. But, Games Workshop are catering for you. You've got Warhammer Underworlds.
Yeah,
you've got Blackstone Fortress. So those low model games.
That's why I'm playing those ones, because literally that was the deal breaker for me on Kill Team. I was like, I'm not measuring. It's one thing when it's 2D and I'm measuring on flat surface, and I'll feel stupid about, okay, I left my guy within 8 inches of that guy. That was my mistake. He should have been 8.5 inches away from that guy. But if you don't pre-measuring, you get into a situation where is someone good at judging just by eyes becomes a crucial skill.
You do now have pre-measuring. Yeah. I don't think Games Workshop has any judging by eye mechanics left in their games, because they, after 25 years of having them in the games, they finally have come around to the notion that
this is not. It's causing more problems than
it's not exactly a nice, clean, neat mechanic.
I did encounter something sort of adjacent to that in terms of distance measured and intent and what you can get away with by the rules written. I think it's in 40k, but it could apply in Kill Team as well. And it comes down to the fact that they're measuring using inches, but the bases are all in metric. Mm-hmm. So you've got these 25mm bases and inch and rules like if you're within an inch of a model, you can engage in close combat. So,
as sort of an interesting addendum to that is that up until very recently, Games Workshop were issuing their models on 25mm or 32mm bases. So the smaller guys were on the 25mm.
Yeah.
25mm is less than an inch.
Yep.
Some of the most recent releases have been on 28mm bases, which is greater than an inch. So even though it's still supposedly the small-sized guy, it is now that crucial bigger or smaller than an inch size.
So if you really want to squeak out the last advantage from the rules, go and get those 25mm bases while you still can.
And it's a point of contention, because you go to tournaments and a tournament organizer will have to enforce, are you on the right bases? Yeah. And that's a thing that Games Workshop have drop the ball on a little bit because they don't have official rules.
Remember, magnetize all your
Not
bases.
engage with the tournament scene. You know, dive out a window when it comes up.
The theory is that you play with the bases that you get in the box, but then you're like, well, 25 years ago when I picked this up, this was the base it came on, so surely that's still legal?
Or even 6 months ago.
Remember, 2020, the year of magnetized bases. You heard it here first. Everyone's going to be magnetizing their bases.
The Necromancer model, when you go through the instructions, it tells you to snip the square base, which has the foot on it, into a circle, so you could glue it down onto your circle base for the current games.
Oh boy.
Fantastic.
Here's a template you can download.
Which Necromancer model?
Okay, so
Standard plastic one.
what else should we say about skirmish games? I'm sure there's still plenty to unpack.
Well, I think we're kind of in the middle of what Games Workshop want to do with it. It's kind of obvious for the low level companies. It's a great way to get in with a small model count, but where are Games Workshop coming from it? Because if we're looking at just Kill Team, it originally felt like they're just trying to cycle people through, but it turned out the game is really, really, really good. Like, it is an absolutely fantastic game, and it's got a pretty big fan base. Although, as we found out, Games Workshop isn't necessarily aware of how big that fan base was.
Yeah, so the assumption was always that Kill Team was designed to be this gateway into 40k, and it turned out not to be in a lot of cases. That being a prime example myself, and I think Baz is the same, it pulled older players back in, which was their intent, and those players had no intention and no plans and no desire to move up to full scale 40k.
This is your second time round. You're not gonna find yourselves back on 6x4 tables.
Yeah, but because even though sure I've gotten some bits, the jump up to full scale 40k is another few £100 worth of models.
Right.
And
Time and effort.
And also the games take much longer. Two players who are practiced, know the rules, can knock out a game of Kill Team in under an hour.
The sort of reduction in size of the game and number of models made obviously means you don't need as much table space either.
Yep.
So that sort of opens up a lot of
absolutely
other places you can play.
Yeah.
The bath, other people's coffee tables.
Make sure to spray your miniatures before playing in the bath.
That's good and lacquered up.
Yep.
Is it causing a resurgence in sort of people clubbing together to meet and play on nights? Much like Blood Bowl you could go to a place that could have 3 or 4 Blood Bowl games going. Are we seeing skirmish games kind of finding a league structure or anything like that? Because the size enables it?
I know that it's happening a bit in some places. I don't have much personal experience of that kind of organised play, but I do know it's happening. I'm in contact with plenty of very active players in other locations.
It is notable that the board size that they've been using for Warcry and Kill Team essentially is the card game board or table size. So your classic store that maybe doesn't have big, massive 6x4 tables ready for a big 40k game, typically they'll have space for people to play Magic, and that space is perfect to play Kill Team or play Warcry on. So yeah, it's definitely easier for stores to run events these days.
Right.
And that ties back into the people didn't make the jump from Kill Team to 40k after getting into Kill Team. The level of convenience that you can pull out your board on a coffee table at anybody's house and just play out your game in 60 to 90 minutes easily enough, and pack it all away and you're done. That's a big factor, and that seems to have caught Games Workshop a little bit by surprise. There was a moment when all of a sudden, when you went into Games Workshop and bought a single box of things, the managers were suddenly asking you, was that for Kill Team or was that for 40k? Where the impression is that a directive came down from on high saying, we don't actually know why those people are buying those things. Please find out for us.
I think it's important to point out that for me and Colin both, we have enough miniatures to have maybe 2 40k armies. Or at least we would if they were all the same faction. What we've ended up with is maybe 6, 7 or 8 different kill teams.
Right, so you dip in on orcs and then think, oh, I might try Tau, that looks cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, and from the hobbyist perspective, that's really good. It's, you
Try more of the game.
You can buy this set of figures that you really like the look of, spend the time putting them together, modifying them, painting them up, get a couple of games out of them, move on to the next project, which is then aesthetically very different and satisfies a different kind of
Different colours. You're not painting glass all the time.
I know I bought the Kill Team, the Rogue Trader set, because I wanted minis if I was running 40k again, the RPG, because this was a set of minis, because one half it was kind of Rogue Trader, navies and core men on the ships, and the other side was warp mutants, and I was like, well, that's bloody perfect for a lot of RPG stuff. And I'm planning on running the Age of Sigmar RPG when it comes out, and all of the Shadespire stuff is doubling for me, as this is basically an encounter's worth of bad guys for every faction. I've got some ghosts,
right.
I've got some ghouls, I've got basically a set for everything at this stage.
So
nearly.
this is a bonus if you're the kind of gamer who doesn't simply sit in one camp like a war gamer. If you've got some tabletop stuff that's kind of enhanced by miniatures, then absolutely you've got this really specific stuff, and you don't need to buy entire armies of it. So
No.
the faction boxes or the kits are going to encompass a lot of what that faction's about, and as you say, gives you good character minis.
Yeah.
That, hey, I love this barbarian looking guy with a crow sort of beak helmet. That's going to be my barbarian in this game.
Like I bought the new the latest Shadespire set, and it was like, here's three Goblin Wolf Riders. All right, this is perfect, because I know the enemy within. There's a bit where they fight a small number of Goblin Wolf Riders, and I'm like, cool. I've got another set which are the Goblins. That'll be the Goblins. That'll be the Wolf Riders, and I've got all the minis I need to run that encounter. You know.
So the skirmish war games obviously run on slightly tighter rule sets. They're kind of modeling a bit more sort of accuracy. Some of the things that happen on battlefield, you've got more individual actions being taken. I'm curious, are they much different from the block movement stuff? I imagine they are. But the question I really want to ask is, are there some more evolutions of skirmish war game systems that we should expect? Is there more ground to cover?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly within Games Workshop's context, Kill Team, one of the negatives you can put on it is that they have been very strict about keeping stat lines in Kill Team exactly the same as in 40k. Most of the core mechanics are largely the same. Now, it differs in very important ways too, but you still roll to hit, roll to wound, take armor saves exactly the same in Kill Team as you do in 40k. There's some extra stuff, but I think if they really do decide Kill Team should be a game to stand entirely on its own, they will do a new edition where they make a break from that, and then it'll start to resemble more like the other more independent games that we've mentioned. So if you have a game like Black Ops, each of the guys is very different, and the mechanics are tailored to the kind of game that they're trying to play. So you can argue that with Kill Team, some of the mechanics that are being carried in from the company level game don't actually suit a skirmish game particularly well.
And we've definitely seen it with some of the releases. So they came out with the Commanders book. Everyone was like, oh my god, Commanders, this is awesome. I can play this, I can play that. And then you get into it and you find out that actually this is really just for friendly play, because they haven't tested or really worked out balance issues in any of it. It's like you can get some really fun games, but you're not going to be able to sit down and play a competitive game with the Commanders to a certain extent. I think some people have, and some people have enjoyed it, but they had to
tweak the rules.
Yeah.
I just want to know how often. Sorry, Shane.
No, I'm just saying 40k is infamous for having its high level commanders who can just mow through endless waves of guys.
And that's fine to an extent in 40k where there are waves of guys.
Yeah.
But if your high level commander who can mow through waves of guys is up against my 6 dudes, I'm in a real bad place.
What I found really interesting in Shadespire was a very different turn structure, in that basically in Shadespire there's 3 turns and everybody's got a total of 4 actions a turn, and that's it. So you've got 12 actions in a game. That's it. That's all you have.
Yeah, I mean, it's complete divergence from anything they've done before. It's wild.
And one of the things I liked in Warcry, for example, was like setting up terrain is ridiculously important in a skirmish game, because it's all about approach to terrain and being smart about the terrain. I thought it was a nice idea. I don't think it worked in Warcry, but it was a nice idea. Was you actually shuffle the deck, you drew out, and you set up the terrain, as indicated on the card.
Ah, okay.
So it wasn't like... Because I've watched games be decided by one player being smarter about terrain than the other in the setup. And go, I'm putting this here, like exactly the right point for me to run up and have cover to shoot on you next round. Because I'm smart and you're not as smart about that stuff. And that was a huge advantage. And it made the setup part of the game really stressful because you could determine who won the game based on the setup in a lot of ways. So it was interesting to see
your
here,
battlefield.
Here is a preset, but I'm not sure they did a lot of thinking about, as a preset, how balanced is this?
Let me get into Warcry for a second, because I think Warcry is maybe the next evolution of what's happening in Games Workshop's thinking. So we've said that Kill Team is a fantastic game, we've said the mechanics are sound, but they have definitely been pushing out stuff just to, or it feels like just to sell models, which is fine. You know, they have great models, so I'll keep buying them, that's not a problem. But the annual is, you know, coming out, and people have seen some of the bits and pieces, and there's a certain amount of disappointment in the Kill Team community that more effort wasn't spent on kind of refining the game and kind of fine-tuning it and locking the mechanics down. Step into Warcry. Warcry is set in the Age of Sigmar setting, but the major factions in it, the kind of core chaos factions, are brand new, completely unseen before, all very distinctive, all very evocative.
Sort of strange cults.
Yeah.
I love those models.
So they did do a set of releases, so you could go play your Age of Sigmar armies in it, and you could kind of pick some models, and you know they appear to have not had great balance by comparison, because a lot of people say that the kind of core chaos factions play really well against each other, but once you bring in your Sigmarites, or you bring in your undead or whatever, that it kind of, the balance goes a bit out of whack, which suggests that was brought in to sell more models. But the core part of Warcry, it's brand new factions, so that wouldn't have been to sell the existing line or to feed people into Age of Sigmar necessarily. It sounds like it was just buy those models, have some fun. And the rules are a complete divergence. So you've got like health pools, and you roll dice to see if you do damage or crits. Like, it's the stat lines are very different to what they had been doing before.
Heading towards sort of RPG rule territory, if you're tracking hit points and things like that.
Perhaps to an extent, but I think the key part there is that it is wonderful to see Games Workshop, who are a company who've built literally decades worth of games on essentially the same mechanics, stepping outside of their comfort zone. You know, the Warcry models do not have the, if anybody's ever played Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer 40k or Woofrup or even, you know, Deathwatch, even the RPGs have the same stat line. You've got your movement, strength, toughness, weapon skill, ballistic skill, and this is different. And it's great to see them not just iterating or piggybacking on rules that are 30 years old and coming up with something new. I think that's great to see.
Now, one of the things with Warcry is I suspect it's very hard to actually play it in a competitive setting properly. Because at least when you're looking at the campaign stuff, it's pretty wild. Like, you can end up with a undead dragon on your side, and your opponent can have 25% more points than you do, and all of their guys have rerolls, but none of your guys do. And oh my god, magic weapons everywhere. It can get pretty wild. But it looks like they've kind of designed that to be more of a fun sit down, and the design with the random board setup and assignment, it kind of gets you straight into the action, and then you kind of play it out. There are some scenarios and some ways it can fall where you're like, well, I guess I've lost this game straight away, which is unfortunate.
Is there an argument for, given the length of games, you can just, we'll switch sides and play the second leg and see how we get on?
Well, at least in the campaign setting, like you play through the game, it can be relatively quick to play and fast, and especially if you're doing a runner for it and trying to disengage, and then at the end of it, you'll make a bunch of rolls, see if your guys get some levels up and magic items, and often you'll walk away with it feeling, you know, that was a horribly one-sided battle, but hey, I got a few extra points, I got to mark a tick off my campaign track and move on. But it looks like they've designed that game to be along that line, which is less competitive, less or more kind of get in, have some fun and play, which feels like they've been looking at what they've been doing. They've realized that skirmish games can sit alone, that they don't have to feed in anywhere, that they are
maybe that they don't even necessarily need a competitive scene where they'd have to support with events. And
And
prizes and all that kind of
the
crap.
campaign system is very interesting because you were earlier asking whether people have been kind of setting up kill team campaigns where they'll turn up and you'll get paired against someone and play the games. And that has been happening, but one of the problems with those campaigns is, round 3, you turn up in your third week and your opponent has quit but never told anyone, and then things start collapsing.
Very true, yeah.
Whereas the approach they've taken for Warcry is you play you print off your campaign sheet. After you play your first game, you tick, you played your first game, and you track your campaign. And then when you turn up in the Games Workshop store, you'll play against someone else who's doing their own campaign. They could be at start, they could be 2 or 3 campaigns down the line and have crazy stuff.
But you might compare sheets and see who's going to be a good match that evening.
Exactly. So, I mean, they seem to have been learning.
Handicap?
No, there's no handicap. No, that's ridiculous.
Oh, just before we wrap up, before we started recording, you'd mentioned that you guys have been tracking some of the current rule set changes and things, and Baz, you have some
Death Denied.
something you want to talk about. Death Denied.
Death Denied. We're going to talk about Death
Our
Denied.
our new Kill Team podcast. Go on. What's Death Denied? What's the problem?
So this is all about the new Kill Team 2019 annual. We've seen that one of the big changes in it, one of the few changes in it, is that the Space Marines, that's this Astartes ability where they spent 2 command points, which is essentially an entire turn worth of your command points, to save your guy. So your guy's going to be dead. You spend your 2 command points, and he's up and at him. He's okay. Made him super tough. Cost 2, which meant you typically didn't spend anything else. You saved all the fancy rerolls and stuff just for this one.
Yeah, typically a game runs, say, 4 turns, and you get 2 command points every turn. So spending 2 command points is about a quarter of your command point resources for an entire game.
Now, I play Astartes. I enjoy them a lot. And I'm a bit weird in that I play the Primaris guys primarily. So they're all 2 wound guys. Okay. So when I'm playing against Colin, he has to get through 2 wounds and then kill my guy. And then there's a bunch of rolls to see if he actually dies, which you can kind of compare that with the Warcry model is arguable over which is the preferred. Either way, after he finally gets that kill, I'll move off my 2 CPs. My guy's back up again. It's back over to Colin to try take him down again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's conflicting things here. Now, I will say, to preface this, is that overall Kill Team is a remarkably well-balanced game. For a game that has a dozen or more different factions in it, it's doing pretty well in overall balance. But the change to Death Denied, it's going from 2 CP to 3 CP, which is a big deal. It's more than an entire turn's worth of CP. Seems to be driven by negative play experience on the other player's part rather than balance, because there's a fairly lively tournament scene for Kill Team. Adeptus Astartes have not been tearing up the tournament scene. They've had one decent result recently, and other than that, they don't make top 4s, they don't make whatever. They're not topping the tables. So they weren't, as a faction, overpowered. They just had this one ability that it sucks for your opponent when you do it, because it is a skirmish game. There could be, your sides could be, especially a Space Marine team, is probably only going to be 6, 7, maybe 8 guys.
Ooh, that's a lot.
Yeah. So if he's only got 6 guys, they're pretty tough. You've got to put a significant amount of effort into putting one down.
Yeah.
And then he just says, no. It's the equivalent of your opponent in Game of Magic has left 2 islands untapped, and you got to do some really cool thing, and then he just plays counterspell, and you're like, oh well, I guess that's that of it.
There's a reason they don't print 2 mana counter spells anymore.
Yeah.
Or Force of Will.
But the driving factor behind it appears to have been that rather than game balance, and that's the bit that is really disappointing, because if you're going to tweak a game with the notion of it being kind of played in a competitive tournament scene, you should really be doing it for balance reasons.
And there were some interesting comments that we've seen floating around. One that really struck home to me is someone saying, actually, this is going to make Astartes players better, because not holding on to all your CPs for that silly tactic and instead spend them on all this other cool stuff, actually a lot better. You're thinking,
But they can already do that if they choose.
Huh. Okay. And if this was one among 100 or so different changes, kind of tweaks and balance fixes and bits and pieces, that would be fine. That would suggest that Games Workshop sat down, did extensive testing, knew what they were talking about. But this is one amongst maybe 2 or 3 changes.
Yeah, and the changes that the community was crying out for didn't happen. So people were really asking for the game is dominated in many areas by, say, plasma guns specifically, because their set of stats are just kind of a really sweet spot in kill
things.
So I don't think anybody would have been unhappy to see the points cost on plasma guns go up a little bit.
Or the limits on the number you can have reduced.
Sure. Yeah. And then at the other end of the scale, they released an expansion book which introduced things like Terminators and, bigger, powerful units. And virtually all of those bigger, powerful units are so expensive in terms of points that if you take them, you are crippling your team. So everybody wanted plasma guns to go up a little bit, Terminators to come down a little bit, and none of that happened.
Yeah, plasma guns, really good for killing Terminators. Just to tie it all together.
Yeah.
The other one is, and one of the reasons I don't feel so bad about the Astartes getting hurt, I also play Tau. I'm a terrible person. And everyone is going, drones, they're so cheap. Maybe they should be a little bit more expensive.
Flood the board.
I'm looking at my 12 drones on the table going, I don't know what you're talking about. That's totally ridiculous. They can't open doors. It's totally balanced and fine.
Future warfare right in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. But these were changes that kind of seemed obvious to the people playing, but maybe it suggests that Games Workshop haven't actually done the work, haven't done the due diligence, as it
just
were.
responding to the criticism rather than examining
Maybe.
where the problems actually lie.
I think it feels like they're a little bit disengaged from their own game.
Right,
They're probably not
with
playing
so
it enough.
many to track, and it's not like they're hiring hundreds of designers.
Yeah, I have heard that they have a very small total design team. They have about 7 guys working their main games and maybe 3 guys to work their smaller games, and that's it. And that's a low number for such a big company.
And that's like 8 or 9 games for that small team to work their way through. And some of them are quite similar in many regards. I'd imagine they get confused quite often about what works where.
Who here hasn't played a game we've understood the game better than the lead designer?
Well, on that thought, would you like to take us out?
Absolutely. So,
Skirmish games.
How many models are your perfect number? Please inform us on Facebook or through any of the other channels. But for now, this party's over.
Thanks for listening to The Adventuring Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there or on Twitter through @adventuringpty. The hosts can be contacted by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. The Adventuring Party is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike version 3 license.
Brilliant stuff.
We need to play the music. It doesn't feel right without the music.
Sometimes we get our guests to sing along. Do you like to sing? That was composed for the show, I believe.
Was it?
Yeah.
I thought it was just Kevin McLeod music.
No, I don't think so. I'm
sure someone
will
will
throw
take
my credit. I found some files in the Dropbox that are just these loops that it's put together from.
Oh, cool.
So it's not a continuous thing. It's like, I could piece together my own sort of version of this if I want to stick part 1 to part 2 and then do part 2 again and part 3 to part 1.
Huh.
There you go. That's just a little behind the curtain. I'll stop recording now.